Our story begins as follows. One afternoon, he said, when I was completely dispirited and disgusted, I stopped work and went out for a walk. In a print shop window I noticed an engraving after one of the old masters. I do not remember what picture it was. I could not then analyze that which attracted me to it, but it fascinated me. The print seller showed me others, and they repeated the same sensation in me. There was a power of motive, a bigness, and a grasp in them. They were nature, rendered grand instead of being belittled by trifling detail and puny execution. I commenced to take them out to nature with me, to compare them with her as she really appeared, and the light began to dawn. He knew he was merely producing coloured drawings, and thinly coloured ones at that, but he knew what he needed to do. But how to get there? George Inness began early to realize his position and role in life, was destined to be a painter, born in Newburgh, New York, on May the 1st, 1825. At the time it was a small town situated on the banks of the Hudson River. His father managed a farm of several acres and was a grocer by trade. George was the fifth son of a family of 13 children. He suffered from illness as a child with epileptic bouts, which he outgrew, but his energies were boundless. He became an omnivorous reader and drew constantly, to the point that his father sought instruction for him with a local artist. George left school at 14 years old due to his lack of interest and poor grades, and because his drawing took precedence over school studies. So his first teacher was a Mr. Barker, which little is known of him today, but it gave direction to the point he stated he had learned all he could teach him, at which time George took at 16 a position of a map engraver. Brief 2 years at the firm, he decided enough was enough, and he opted to travel and paint the surrounding hills, woods, and fields of northern New Jersey, where his father had retired recently with his family on 25 acres. Experimenting on his canvases unaided, producing many experiments of colour, but at the same time storing up mental images and impressions to serve a future need. His trend from the first was toward landscapes, and in this great open book of nature he may be said later to have founded a new American school. His single course of instruction at this time was a very few weeks spent in the studio of Régis Gignoux, a French landscape painter of some note who had lately established a studio in New York. Inness was then in his 20th year. It should be noted that Régis François Gignoux was a distinguished 19th century artist whose work celebrated the uplifting aspects of the American landscape. Born in Lyon, France, Gignoux trained at the Académie des Beaux-Arts in Paris, where his instructor, the history painter Paul Delaroche, encouraged his interest in landscape painting. He travelled to the United States in 1840 in pursuit of an American woman and became entranced with the American wilderness. Devoting himself to both the woman, who became his wife, and the country, Gignoux settled in New York and painted the grand sights of the United States, including Niagara Falls, the Catskill Mountains, Mount Washington, and Mammoth Cave in Kentucky, where he became famous for his winter landscapes. George knew such instruction as this, however, was practically valueless, not only on account of the short time given to it, but also by reason of Inness's own temperament and decided ideas of his own, so we may say that his genius grew in native soil without conventional culture or pruning save at his own hands. It was as natural for Inness to paint as it was for him to breathe, said a close associate of his, Elliot Dangerfield, stating. He painted because he could not help it, and in his own way. He had no perpetual teachers beyond his personal experience and observation, and he also had no pupils. He was his own exponent from first to last. It is interesting to note that while studying in New York, Inness lived at the Astor House and paid his board in pictures. Some of his earliest pictures were painted at the home of his brother, James Inness, in Pottsville, Pennsylvania. Amid these days of early and bitter struggle in New York, the artist turned aside to romance, and like many another who can scarcely earn a living for himself, he married. The details attending this romance are meagre but sad. The bride contracted a cold upon her wedding day, which soon developed into consumption, and in 6 months she passed away. The following year he married again, this time more fortunately, for his wife proved a helpmeet to him during all his life. Finally, in 1847, the way was opened. He found a valuable friend and patron in a dry goods auctioneer by the name of Ogden Haggerty, who not only bought his pictures but advanced the funds necessary for his European journey. The elated young artist proceeded first to London, and there trod the same ground from gallery to gallery which Stuart, Alston, Trumbull, and others of the West School of 70 years before. But his ideals were different from theirs. He represented a new American movement, both in the type and quality of his work, which was to shake itself free from foreign tradition and rest upon the bedrock of nature alone. After a short time spent in London, he went on to Rome, where he lingered for 15 months, a period of unflagging delight, whether spent visiting the rare art treasures or wandering over the picturesque countryside. His mind was filling up with images and impressions to serve him later. Florence claimed him for a time, and then he returned to America, his style still unformed, yet breaking little by little through the mature restraints. It was at this time that pictures by foreign painters were beginning to reach the United States in any appreciable quantity. The few which Inness saw soon set him to hungering for Europe afresh, and selling what pictures he could complete in a short time, he again set sail across the Atlantic. This time he went to Paris, where he speedily fell under the influence of the French school, as exemplified by Millet, Rousseau, Daubigny, and Corot. Millet was then 35, 10 years older than Inness, and the young American thought him to be the greatest figure painter that ever lived. He could not appreciate Millet's landscapes, but the figures, homely or indistinct though they might be, revealed for him the very essence of human feeling. Rousseau also was a subject of his most profound admiration. This first year spent in Paris was, in a word, of the utmost service to him. It seemed to supply many things he had hitherto needed, and left him well on the road from apprenticeship to master painting. On his return to America, he spent 4 years in New England, amid the lovely rural scenery round about Medfield, Massachusetts. Then for a third time he went abroad for a few months more, and upon his return made his home at Eaglewood, New Jersey. All these adventures here and yonder were but the visible marks of a soul in its growth. They were years of struggle inwardly and outwardly, when the art of today became the doubtful theory of the morrow. At one time 3 of his older brothers kept him afloat for a year by buying his pictures and selling them again when and where they could. Neither at this time nor at any other did he have the remotest idea of the value of money, and to relieve him of one distress was but to provide the means for him to fall into another. His contempt for the mercantile life was amusingly blunt. One of his earliest theories was that all trade was under obligations to sustain art, and that the merchants were created to support the artists. Something still in the minds of artists today. During his residence at Eaglewood in the early 60s, Inness took up the study of theology and metaphysics, a fact which deserves careful mention as it exercised the most profound influence over his art. As a boy, he had been a dreamer, visionary, recluse, a student of nature. As a man, he turned his thoughts to books of profound philosophy and to the study of his fellow man. For 7 years he read nothing else, his splendid intellect revelling in the difficult fields which it unfolded to him. His environment during his childhood and youth was extremely well calculated to give such a tendency to his active temperament and thinking. His mother, who died in his 15th year, was a Methodist, and brought up her children in strict compliance with it. At Eaglewood, George came in touch with a congenial fellow artist, William Page, and also found a valuable agent in Marcus Spring, a singular character of the day. Spring came from a well-known family and was practically the founder of Eaglewood. He conducted a military school, and our modern manual is based largely upon his system. It was at his invitation that Inness located there, and the curious arrangement made suited the artist's easy-going ways exactly. Mr. Spring provided Inness with his living expenses, while Inness turned over his pictures as fast as they were painted to Spring, who sold them as opportunity offered. It is stated that some of these paintings still come to light from time to time. In 1868, Inness was elected a member of the National Academy of Design, after having been an associate for some 15 years. He went abroad for the fourth time in 1871, remaining 4 years, were divided between Paris and Rome. In each of these foreign visits, he seems to have gained something which took him a stride farther in his work. Yet there is no man whom he can be said to have copied or imitated. He gleaned the best from both the old and the new, and brought to bear upon it his own intellectuality and close sense of nature. There was no painter who was more intimate with the varying moods of field and forest, and to interpret these moods seemed to him to be the highest duty imposed on man. "Art is an essence as subtle as the humanity of God," said he, "and like it is personal only to love, a stranger to the worldly minded, a myth to the mere intellect. I would not give a fig for art ideas except as they represent what I in common with all men need most, the good of our practice in the art of life. Rivers, streams, the rippling brook, hillsides, sky and clouds, all things that we see will convey the sentiment of the highest art if we are in the love of God and the desire of the truth." At another time he said, "The purpose of the painter is simply to reproduce in other minds the impression which a scene has made upon him. A work of art does not appeal to the intellect. It does not appeal to the moral sense. Its aim is not to instruct, but to awaken an emotion. Its real greatness consists in the quality and force of this emotion." Inness spent the first year after his return in Boston, where his art had already found admirers. Then he moved permanently to New York, setting up his easel in the Holbein Studios on West 55th Street. But the Jersey Hills, just across the Hudson, which had been the scene of many a boyhood ramble, called him again insistently, and obeying their summons, he turned to them for rest and inspiration and a home for his family. Like many another victim of the comic papers, he became a eucommuter, spending his hours of grind amid the roar of the rapacious city, and the golden hours of freedom amid rural surroundings congenial to his art. He found a roomy frame house in Montclair, a dozen miles out, and here he spent the closing years of his life. By this time the painter had come into his own, though the journey had been long and arduous. Public recognition came late, and while a few collectors had prized his canvases, almost none had thought it worth while to make a business of collecting them. But from 1875 on, the tide turned more and more in his favour, and his prices rose correspondingly. In 1867 the Paris Salon had selected his American Sunset as a representative work of American art. He had also two distinct methods. In early life he was painstaking. Later he worked broadly, with an eye to the general effect. He particularly excelled in cloud, tree, and sky subjects. His method of working was peculiar. He would always paint standing, and while he began rapidly and nervously, his speed would diminish and his nerves steady as he advanced. As the difficulty of his subject grew upon him, he would work slower and slower, till finally, with a grunt of impatience, he quit the subject entirely for the time being and set himself at a new one. There were invariably a dozen or more pictures in various stages of completion in his studio. Occasionally, in a happy mood, he would paint steadily till one was finished. More often he would turn aside to complete one with an entirely different subject. Frequently a picture far advanced, and perhaps even completed, would arouse his dissatisfaction, and he would fall to and alter it completely. His peculiar energy and nervous excitement at his work on such occasions had about it the suggestion of a battle. And, indeed, it was a battle the artist was fighting, with the impulse of genius to nerve his hand. Merely to look at the portrait of this man with his lion-like mane and careless attire suggests the shock of battle. Trumbull thus describes him. He was a man of the middle stature, of a spare frame, with a face full of character, and grey, penetrating eyes. He wore the thin beard of a man whose face had never known the touch of the razor, and his broad brow was framed in a mass of long and always disorderly hair. He was careless in his dress, so that the picturesque ensemble of head and figure was not disturbed. Invincible is perhaps the one word that defines George Inness's character. Arrogant he has been called, but falsely, egotistical, selfish, and all the other phrases that unsuccessful, jealous minds usually apply to those who are intolerant of false efforts and falser success. Where alone truth is the aim and truth the goal. Never once in all my long acquaintance with him have I known Inness satisfied with a work of his times without number. I have seen a new light flash in his eyes, a quick, eager toss of the head and thrusting back of the hair, when some problem with which he had been struggling for days or months, perhaps years, was yielding under the sway of his fierce energy. Then it was he gave vent to those expressions of satisfaction which have been called conceit. But mark you, when the morning came, or the new mood, be that canvas never so fine, if one thing there jarred on the man's artistic sensibility, he attacked it with all the old enthusiasm, with a dogged determination to bring it to his own high standard. His moods were so well known to me that I could readily tell from his very knock at my door whether I was to be taken off across the hall to his studio to view some great advance in his picture, or whether he was to drop into a chair in silence for a while, worn, tired, and with that depression of spirit which only the artistic nature can understand. At such a time one word upon some abstract theme, no matter what, if really serious, would stir him into life and intense speech. It would not be argument, as between two, for when Inness talked, the flame needed no draught. It blazed and flared until his own conclusions were reached, and then faded, even as the glow on some of his own forest trees seemed to fade in the twilight time until the deep silence left no room for speech. He came into my studio one day, with all the unrest and nervous eagerness which characterized him when thinking intensely, threw out several sentences about his picture and its purpose. Then with a sort of mad rush he said, "What's it all about? What does it mean, this striving, this everlasting painting, 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 away one's life? What is art?" That's the question I've been asking myself, and I've answered it this way. I drew a writing pad to me and jotted down his words. They are worth thinking about oftener than once. Art is the endeavour on the part of mind to express, through the senses, ideas of the great principles of unity. Perhaps no more characteristic sentence has ever been recorded of him. It satisfied him. He had made his conclusion and expressed it. Did not propose to supply us with brains to understand what the principles of unity may be. We might struggle as we pleased with that problem, as perhaps he had struggled with the other, although to a tyro the last seems exactly the same as the first. Art, religion, and the single tax theory were his chief themes, and by a curiously interesting weaving, his logic could make all three one and the same thing. Oblivious to externals, both of persons and things, he often said and did much that evoked harsh criticism, but at heart, it may be truthfully said, he was as gentle as a child, even tender and swiftly sympathetic. What a delight it was to watch him paint, in one of those impetuous moods which so often possessed him. The colours were almost never mixed. He had his blue theories, black, umber, and, in earlier days, bitumen. He even had an orange chrome phase. With a great mass of colour he attacked the canvas, spreading it with incredible swiftness, marking in the great masses with a skill and method all his own, and impossible to imitate. Here, there, all over the canvas, rub, dig, scratch, until the very brushes seemed to rebel. But stand here 15 feet away. What a marvellous change is there! A great rolling, billowy cloud sweeping across the blue expanse, graded with such subtle skill over the undertone. Vast trees with sunlight flecking their trunks, meadows, ponds, mere suggestions but beautiful. Foregrounds filled with detail where there had been no apparent effort to produce it. Delicate flowers scratched in with the thumbnail or handle of the brush. One's imagination was so quickened that it supplied all the finish needed. Elliot Dangerfield continues, "I once had the good fortune to paint a little picture that pleased him. He caught sight of it. lying on the floor against the wall, and exclaimed, "Hello, who did that?" I told him. Stooping down, he caught it up, pushed his glasses far back on his head, examined it with many expressions that I remember with deep satisfaction, put it down again, and walked out of the room. The next morning he came in again, and taking up the picture asked, "What do you expect to get for that?" I mentioned a price, thinking he meant to advise someone to buy it, but he answered at once, "I'll take it," walked to the desk and made out a cheque. Then, as if he meant to help me still farther up the hill, he caught up my palette and brushes and for an hour painted a figure on the picture which I had thought finished, to show me how it ought to be done. I have never touched that picture. It remains a souvenir of the day I had my biggest lesson in art. In his conversations, especially on art, he was always concise, and he always had something worthwhile to say. "I never knew a man whose offhand thoughts were so well worth preserving," said George William Sheldon, "and I never took a stroll with him without wishing that some invisible scribe might make a report of his talk for the benefit of art students." Inness's intellectual ideas were always great and noble, and the ideas reflected upon his canvases reflect this nobility. He had no sort of use for mediocre work, which he characterized as intellectual dishwater. He took no part in the societies to which he belonged, beyond sending pictures to the exhibitions, and for prizes or medals he had an outspoken contempt. He believed that the pursuit of art was its own reward. "If you think to work, to do your best," he said, "the world does not then appreciate you, what satisfaction can a diploma or a medal bring? They are only the recognition of a few men, who appreciate you anyhow, and they go to so many who are not worthy of them, that they do not carry any real significance to those who may deserve them. Pass your verdict upon yourself, if you are capable of criticizing yourself. The verdict of the world will be passed in due time, and it will be a just one, even if it does not sustain that of prize committees and juries of award." Inness worked and studied up to the last. His ill health as a boy and young man had been successfully combated by his life in the open air, so that he all but rounded his 70. He died while on a tour abroad at the Bridge of Allan, Scotland, on August 3rd, 1894. His wife, a son and a daughter survived him. His son, George Inness, was born in Paris in 1854 and studied with his father in Rome. The father lived to see the son take high rank among contemporary artists. The daughter married Jonathan Scott Hartley, the sculptor and academician. No artist need fear that his work will not find sympathy if only he works earnestly and lovingly. These words of the painter might fittingly have been inscribed upon Inness's monument, for they strike the keynote of his life. With him, art was no mere vocation. It was his religion, and he pursued it with all the fierce passion of a devotee. And finally, we hope you enjoyed this episode on the great landscape artist George Inness, as much as we did in learning more about him and his artwork. So with that, thank you to our subscribers, and remember to leave a like so we can grow the channel. Until next time, bye for now.